Mr. Fattal, how were you following Arab Spring? I mean, were you following through the regular media or through social networks?
Actually, I and we were following it through regular media, social network, and through members of the Arab Spring directly in Tunisia, in Egypt, and Libya as well. Even in Libya, it was a bit difficult because the communications were curtailed, but yes.
How was it important to have internet in 2011 to do such things? Would it be possible to make such a revolution 20 years ago?
You know, last year I chaired a session in Kuwait, which was at the Arab Media Forum, which was one of the events of it was to do with the Arab Spring and social media and the role of social media. What has become very clear is that social media were the right tool for the right time to actually help the Arabs step up and try to reach what they have always sought. As we were discussing earlier on, the Eastern Bloc, known as the Eastern Bloc to the world, experienced their own spring in the mid-80s. The Arab world was probably ripe as well at that time, but the political and economic situation prevented that because those dictators who were in power back then were still supported by the West, and it was an approach to maintain the status quo. And despite the aspirations of the Arab people, you did not see the Arab Spring back in the 80s. Social media had a fundamental role as a tool in taking that to the next step.
In what sense? They were not toppled by Twitter.
No, they were not. Facebook, Twitter, and many other social networks became a tool in letting people know they're not alone. You know, if you and I were to go on, and let's say we want to organize a demonstration and let's say march to Parliament, when we get to Parliament and we find out there's 10,000 people, we say, oh my God, there's 10,000 people. Through social media, they discovered there was more than just themselves. It was 5,000, 10,000, 100,000. You see the trigger events in Tunisia where the young man, the street vendor, burnt himself. These Tunisian people started adding their names to these social network pages. And all of a sudden you have 10,000, 50,000. You say, well, let's meet in that particular square, and you discover there's not enough space for people. And that's exactly what happened in Egypt, where all of a sudden now the world was shocked when they saw 1 million people in Tahrir Square. They were able to organize themselves through Twitter, through Facebook, despite the government, as you recall, cutting the networks and the internet.
But you're not saying that every street vendor or every, like the shoe brusher in Northern Africa is now on Twitter or Facebook.
We're not saying that. I think. Well, actually, I'll give you a statistic. The numbers of internet, Arabic countries, 22 countries, total population somewhere around the 350 million. 2 years ago, the statistics were that about 40 million were connected on the internet. Today, 2 years later, it's closer to about 80 million.
So it doubled.
It doubled. The issue of connectivity was no longer as much of an issue because a lot of people are using their mobile phones. So now they're connected. They have applications. They can now use them. Remember, they're still using the internet, and their ability to use the internet is because of their the English internet in the Latin alphabet URLs. So once you have an internet that becomes multilingual, Arabic, Cyrillic, etc., you will see the numbers jump. So does that mean that the shoe shiner is also connected to Twitter? You know what? Possibly. If his phone is able, he can connect.
Is it realistic? I mean, the regular people, I'm not talking about the people, the academics, the people, the students, the pupils. I'm talking about the regular people, the lower classes. Would they be using social networks and internet these days in Middle East only because what happened in Arabian Spring? You know,
I always use this example when I'm attending events around the world. If somebody in England decides to march on the government, they are objecting to something, the worst they could expect is the police will be standing in front of them and maybe they'll get pushed around. In the Arab world, they are expecting bullets, they're expecting tanks, because their aspirations is far greater than changing a small law. They're looking for a brighter future. So they are more engaged today because where they came from and where they want to go is a big gap. Whereas in developed nations, it's like minor changes. And that's why you see the engagement. You look at Western elections, 30%, 40% of those who can't vote, vote. You look at the participation in the Arab Spring, you're talking millions. These are people who are engaged. They want to see a better future. And their aspiration is no different than what you want for your children, what I want for my children, or what a Chinese person wants for his children in China or in the United States. So these are universal values. The challenge I think that I see is the Arab Spring has the opportunity, it will change things. It is going to change the de facto mode of operation for politics around the world.
Now, but my question was rather, is it, I mean, the spreading of the social networks and understanding of the social network, is it elite basically communicating and telling the rest what is going on, or is it really widespread among all the people?
I think there is an element of elitism to it, but not entirely. Anybody can go and start posting and doing stuff.
Are they?
And they are. As a matter of fact, a lot of what has been done in the Arab world was started by young people who probably be the same age as your children and mine. But they are engaged, they are determined, and they have the sense of identity. They want something better. They've seen the older generation fail.
How come that the governments of those countries, the regimes that they are trying to topple, were not using the same social media in order to have a counteroffensive?
It's a very good question. Actually, they started using it. Today, you go to Syria, Skype is not disconnected. Internet's still there, but you can assume that it's being monitored. Egypt is the first case where a government went and cut off the internet. So that did not stop. As a matter of fact, it did the opposite. People who could no longer understand what's going on, guess what they did? They all marched to Tahrir Square. So instead of having 1 million, you had 3 million. So it worked to the opposite. In that sense, I think there is a great opportunity for international, global politics to change. We've seen this, and this is perhaps the disappointment with many in the United States position, that it's one thing to say we support the aspirations of the Arab people, but you look at Egypt, the government has removed Mubarak. The military, after a year later, the Egyptians are saying nothing has changed. They went back to the street again. And I think we are in an age of what I call the age of new enlightenment. It's empowerment of the individual. The expression I always use is the genie is out of the bottle. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You either help them fulfill their aspirations, and we end up in a much better world and a much peaceful world, or you try to continue to try to absorb it. And that's where I think the challenge is.
It sounds like the social network fairy tale. I mean, everything is falling once when the people take the power in their hands. How come that it's not working in Syria?
Well, Syria is interesting. Again, your question assumes that the social network is what caused the revolutions. The social network was just a tool.
You said it was a tool, and it was a crucial tool.
Crucial tool. But from the day when Mubarak was toppled, a lot of the other Arab countries started to figure out how to actually leverage social media to actually combat the information that's coming from the from anti-government supporters. So, and then this becomes an issue: which is credible, which is not credible. It becomes a bit confusing. And then also, then you have foreign interest coming in, funding players to come in and start putting out new information, and you don't know what the theme is. So I think to some extent, social media reach its plateau of what it can influence on the ground. So going back to Syria, the Syria situation is no longer just an issue of Facebook, Twitter, or other social network. It's a political situation because Syria, Israel, Iran, Lebanon through Hezbollah, These are all dynamics in the power and the shift. And today Syria, contrary to all of the other Arab nations, does not have a single event that you could say is a game changer to stop the killing and the violence against civilians. We saw in Egypt the United States gave the green light for the military to push Mubarak and take over, guarantee the peace treaty with Israel, but you had calm. In Libya, you had the example of NATO getting involved. If NATO had not been involved, Gaddafi could have lasted 2, 3 years, 4 years. Nobody knows how long it could have. So that Libya is a game. NATO's involvement is a game changer. Syria, there is no game changer. Syria, to just give you an example, for the region, just like we have the universe, there's gravity that puts all of the planets that know their order and they know their circles and they know their routine. The region, Syria, is that gravity. The problem that we are seeing now in the last few months is that destabilization, whether it's the regime collapse, whether the country becoming segregated on religious terms, means that that gravity collapses and then the region goes out of equilibrium. And I think that loss of equilibrium is, in my opinion, a disaster because you don't know what's going to happen.
You've been born in Syria.
Correct.
Is it all good guys and bad guys as we see it when we hear the reports from Syria now?
You know, it's not good guys and it's not good guys and bad guys. There are good guys on both sides and bad guys on both sides now, unfortunately. The government, in my opinion, has failed in the early days of the uprising to actually do the right thing. And this started in Daraa, where children were actually taken away from schools. Some of them were returned tortured, children from the age of 8 to 14. And I think the president has an opportunity then to actually clean it up, and people would have been chanting. You know, they would have been really pleased with what he did because they liked him. He's young, he's progressive. What they needed to see is that symbolic action to actually say, well, this was not good. Those who actually hurt the children or those who did inappropriate things will be put to trial. But that did not happen, unfortunately. And the Syria uprising had nothing to do with a change of regime to start with. But then, like we saw in Tunisia, like we saw in Egypt, things start building up momentum. And now, on the ground, nobody can say that there's no outside interference in Syria.
Are you saying there's no good solution? There's no good...
Unfortunately, I do not see, and I hope I'm wrong, but I do not see any solution today that would stop the bleeding of the innocent civilians. There needs to be a change of tactics from the government. There needs to be a change of tactics from the opposition, which is fragmented, by the way. You have a lot of opposition that is very loyal to Syria. You have opposition that is, with all due respect, bought and sold from the outside. On Syrian ground, if you've already been bought and sold on the outside, you have no role in Syria. That's really the belief that a lot of Syrians feel, regardless of from their religion.
One last question. Is it all to politicians now? We have a possibility of war between Iran and Israel. With the strength, with the power of the social networks, can we say that the people might have a say, that they can communicate directly and prevent the war, or is it just my hippie thinking?
You know what? I would love to agree with your hippie thinking. I have talked to a lot of people from a lot of communities, and I can tell you this, nobody wants war. The majority of people don't want war. There are certain groups that have influence, that have power, that and control media, that actually push on their agenda, which in my opinion is catastrophic. There's no solution to war. The prospect of an Israeli attack on the Iran nuclear facility has always been on the agenda since the latest government has taken place. However, I think the events in Syria and the possibility of destabilization in Syria and the possibility of limiting the influence of Hezbollah and cutting off that connection with Iran unfortunately, makes the prospect of an attack on Iran far more likely the minute Syria is destabilized. Because then, for those who really are drumming the beat, hitting the drums of war, to them it's, we've limited the possibility of war on the borders, then it's all from the outside, just go and attack. And unfortunately, that will end up in a major disaster that will take us into oblivion. I don't think that should be allowed to happen. Last point, personally, I think any citizen in the world, whether they're Israeli, they're Arab, those who can should march on their government and say, no war, not in my name. I think if they can do that, they will send a message that this kind of a thought is unacceptable, and there's always a way to reach peaceful means. The Russians 4 years ago came up with a solution for the Iran nuclear program. They offered to provide Iran the enriched uranium, a condition Iran ceases enrichment, and then they would have what they need for it was torpedoed.
Yep. So are you saying the Facebook can start a revolution, but it cannot stop the war?
Facebook is only a tool. It can't even start a revolution. The events and the experiences of a people for 20, 30 years of oppression, that's what starts a revolution. They've started revolutions before. They've all failed because they had no way of working together and uniting to know that they're not alone.
But there's a way to work together now. So can it stop the war?
I think there is a way that Arabs, Israelis, Muslim, Jews, Christians, of people of all faith, even those who don't have a faith, to say no war, not in my name.
You believe that will help?
Let me share something else with you to close this interview. Although I'm pessimistic on certain areas where I think the power of the media and controlled media does push. Simple example, the horrible news we've heard yesterday and today about the Toulouse man who came in and killed 7 Jews, including 3 children. That's unacceptable. But unfortunately, this will be used as the scaremongering about why we need, certain people need to do something to protect themselves. Not again. We are in the age of enlightenment. The average Arab who participated in the Arab Spring, the average Chinese individual, your Serbian colleagues, we all want the same thing for ourselves, for our children. We want dignity, we want peace, we want opportunity, we want our children to grow up in a wholesome environment. And guess what? These are universal values. Nobody has a claim on this. It's the age of the Arab Spring and the enlightenment that I see that I'm willing to bet on. So what you're describing here is, can we change it? I think we can, yes.
Mr. Fattal, thank you for this interview.
My pleasure, thank you.